Welcome to this episode of the Common Sense Skeptic, which is being produced while critics and fanboys alike wait for SpaceX to eventually attempt an orbital launch with Starship from Boca Chica. Almost 3 years after our first episode dissecting the claims that Musk had already been making for several years about the imagined capability of the craft, previously known as the MCT, the ITS, and the BFR. 2 years after its last hop with SN-15 in May of 2021, that resulted in the only relatively safe landing to date, if you ignore the fire in the skirt that had to be put out before the vehicle exploded like SN-10 did. Quite surprisingly, after the fanboy April 10th deadline came and went, the FAA did grant a launch license for this test article for April 17th of 2023. That is surprising because about a year ago on June 13th of 2022, the FAA issued a list of over 75 actions that SpaceX must undertake before a launch license would be issued for Starship, and those were just the actions required to mitigate the environmental impact to the local protected wildlife areas. It would be interesting to see who, if anyone, was overseeing that checklist, and how many of the items, if any, have been completed. One of the reasons we doubt this checklist has actually been complied with is because one of the mandated changes outlined in that document has obviously been ignored. And this will, without doubt, affect the endangered turtle nesting season that is currently underway in Boca Chica. The documented requirement for Musk to adhere to was to adjust the light pollution coming from his sites. This is what the production and launch facilities currently look like at night this week, courtesy of the Watching Paint Dry squad at NASA Spaceflight. Both the assembly plant and the launch area are lit up like it's the middle of a summer afternoon. So when the endangered turtle babies emerge from the nesting beach sand, they're going to head towards that light source, away from the sea, away from safety, rather than follow the moonlight glare off the water to the surf. This is a known issue with artificial lighting, where the babies are drawn to the brightest horizon, and the result will be the death of entire batches of endangered turtle hatchlings. As you can tell, it's pretty obvious that Musk is not taking that FAA checklist seriously, and will meanwhile continue to blame regulators for his own failure to act and respond appropriately. It would be great if the FAA released an update as to whether or not SpaceX has met any of the criteria laid out for them in detail last year. While we were tying up loose ends for this episode, Starship's April 17th test launch turned into a scrub, and now SpaceX is looking at doing it again on April 20th, 420. Which a lot of people on Twitter and on our own community page were already convinced was going to be the case long before Musk pulled the plug with only 8 minutes before ignition, due to Musk's pathological need to be the king of the stoners that form the core of his muskrat army. Now we don't like the odds of this maiden launch being successful whenever it comes down, and that's no surprise to anyone. The more we've learned about the ship, and the more nonsense claims Musk has made about it over the past 3 years, the less credibility we've given the overall project in general. The shortcuts that Musk has taken, the criticism that he fires people over, the way he ran locals out of their homes, and the endangered wildlife he couldn't give two shits about, none of that bodes well from a karma point of view. And since Musk himself only gives the launch a 50-50 chance of going according to plan, well, that officially puts us in the throwing spaghetti theory phase of commercial space development. Let's throw everything at the wall and hope that something sticks. Which by any professional engineer's assessment is a horrible paradigm to operate under. Just for kicks, since we know without a doubt this machine will explode at some point, we opened up a poll on our YouTube community page that garnered over 2,100 votes, with our own prediction leading the way, that the vehicle doesn't clear the tower before exploding. Our leading reason for that prediction is blast damage to the engine bells from pad shrapnel blasted apart by the 33 Raptor 2 engines. Other options in our survey follow the timeline of clearing the tower, before and after booster separation, and ending with the splashdown in the Pacific off the coast of Hawaii. Since the launch has again been postponed, you still have an opportunity to cast your vote. The FAA must have been out of their damn minds to license this launch. Certainly no NASA launch would have ever moved ahead with 50-50 odds of success. A loss of vehicle at NASA is an anomaly they do their absolute best to avoid. At Boca Chica, with Musk in charge, that is an expected outcome. It almost beggars belief that so many hopes and NASA contracts are being pinned to the unguaranteed success of this questionable vehicle and operational paradigm, considering how far removed Starship is from the functionality of the best machine ever put into space. Of course, we're referring to the Space Shuttle. When muskrats pretend that Starship is the successor to the Shuttle and that all of humanity will somehow be saved by Musk's giant tinfoil tube, they either, out of fanboy spite or fool's ignorance, dismiss the obvious advances the Shuttle brought to the exploration of space. Belittling comments like this 2018 video title from Tim Dodd, asking if what was called BFR at the time was just a new space shuttle, in a derogatory fashion. Hell, Starship wishes it could be the new space shuttle. The mission versatility of Shuttle remains unmatched. Without the Shuttle, there is no ISS as we know it today, since it was built up piece by piece, the majority of those components carried to orbit in a shuttle hold. To this day, the Shuttle has still delivered more astronauts to orbit than any other system that's still in operation. Soyuz, which didn't cease operations over the 12 years since Shuttle was retired, still remains a distant second. Without the Shuttle, there was no Hubble, and there was no emergency repair of the Hubble either after its delivery to orbit, another function that Starship cannot possibly serve. So let's revisit history and put the cards on the table as to what rockets, including the Starship, are, what Shuttle was, and revisit the advancements that Shuttle represented over anything in use today, before we take a look to the future. We might as well start off with the simplest of questions. What is a rocket? Simply put, a rocket is a vehicle comprised of roughly 99% structure and fuel, delivering a payload of 1% the total mass of the loaded vehicle, and that payload is brute forced through the thickest part of Earth's atmosphere using a series of controlled explosions in a series of vehicle stages. At least the hope and prayer on ignition is that all of the explosions are controlled. The rocket equation governing these calculations is absolute, and as a result, multi-stage rockets really have not changed that much since the Apollo era. Going back even further to World War II, the first German rockets ran off the same principles, and those principles were first toyed with over 1,000 years ago by the Chinese when they invented rocketry and fireworks. To understand the history of the Space Shuttle, you need to have a handle on the company that created her, and that would be Rockwell International, a conglomerate of companies that at one point was one of the biggest companies in the world. Rockwell itself had a fascinating history involving many products and brand names that still exist today. The namesake of the company, Willard Rockwell, made himself rich by inventing a new bearing system for truck axles near the end of World War I. His company merged with another company in 1928, and he became chairman of the combined board 12 years later. Rockwell grew both by expansion and by acquisition into a multifaceted international conglomerate that was heavily involved in two major NASA programs, both of which brought humans to space. North American Rockwell, as it was known at the time, was the manufacturer that supplied the Apollo missions with the Apollo Command and Control Module, and a decade later, they became the designer and builder of the Space Shuttle orbiter herself. Rockwell became NASA's top contractor, as well as a top contractor for the Air Force, as the creator of the B-1 Lancer bomber, with the first flight in 1974 and 104 units built mainly between 1983 and 1988. This supersonic bomber, referred to as the Bone, continues to see active duty with a planned retirement for the fleet by 2036. Rockwell Aviation produced several other planes as well, including the OV-10 Bronco, jet trainers, and experimental prototypes. It would be fair and accurate to say Rockwell was one of the most trusted contractors for the US federal government. Right around the same time that Shuttle was being worked out, the company founder and CEO Willard Rockwell died in 1978, leaving the company to his son Willard Jr., who had assisted the growth of the company through government connections and contracts. When Jr. stepped down as CEO only a year later, Rockwell handed the reins to Bob Anderson, and through the 80s, Rockwell flourished like never before. It became the largest U.S. defense contractor and largest NASA contractor. In 1985, Rockwell also closed a $1.6 billion majority cash deal to acquire Allen Bradley to become a producer of industrial automation hardware and software, and this acquisition would go on to become their greatest going concern. Anderson took the company to number 27 on the Fortune 500 with annual sales of $12 billion produced by their workforce of 115,000 workers that were now organized into 9 major divisions: space, aircraft, defense electronics, commercial electronics, light-duty automotive, heavy-duty automotive, printing presses, valve and meters, and industrial automation. Anderson stayed on as CEO until February of 1988, overseeing the completion of the Space Shuttle deliveries and the B-1 bomber program. Company president Donald R. Beale took over as CEO and his goal was to diversify the company away from government contracts in light of the end of the Cold War, which would see a drastic cut in defense spending, which came to be known as the peace dividend. The company, founded in 1919 by Rockwell and brought to its apex by Anderson in 1988, did not survive into the 21st century in its previous form as a result. Their space program that had created the Apollo Control and Command Module and the Space Shuttle was bundled together with the Aircraft and Defense Electronics Division to be sold off to Boeing for only $3.2 billion. All but two of the other divisions were parceled up and sold off. The first was Rockwell Automation, which continues to operate today as a $36 billion publicly traded company employing 26,000 people. Their NYSE symbol is ROK. The second division, which was also publicly traded under their symbol COL, when it split away in 2001, was Rockwell Collins, the former avionics division of Rockwell International. In 2018, this company, that employed 20,000 people, was acquired by United Technology Corporation for $30 billion, then merged with UTC Aerospace to form Collins Aerospace, which in turn became a subsidiary of Raytheon Technologies on April 3rd of 2020 in a deal worth $135 billion. Today, Collins Aerospace is still a subsidiary of Raytheon, and they're a huge defense and aerospace contractor that employs 68,000 people, some of whom are currently working with ILC Dover to develop NASA's next-generation spacesuits. Suffice it to say, Rockwell's genes are still very much part of today's aerospace industry DNA. We are of the generation that grew up watching Shuttle's development, flight schedule, and eventual retirement. For the 70s and 80s babies, this was our spaceship, the same way Saturn V belonged to the children of the 50s and 60s. We still admired the Saturn V and respected its achievements, but there was less of a personal connection compared to the shuttle. Schools let us cut class to watch every shuttle launch in the auditorium. This massive machine, to our eyes, was a masterwork and a thing of beauty, a culmination of every lesson learned the hard way by NASA in the decades prior, and every expectation of space exploration for decades to come. We look forward to her launches, celebrated her success, and we mourned her loss twice. Shuttle launched 135 times. 134 of those vehicles made it to orbit. 133 of them completed their missions and made it back to the ground safely. The Challenger disaster could have been avoided by using more stringent tests that caught the failing O-ring, and indeed that failure caused a top-down reassessment and checklist of vehicle health before the program was restarted without another loss of vehicle during launch. Those new protocols resulted in a 100% safety rating on launches afterwards. Columbia made it safely to orbit and completed their mission, but failed on descent through Earth's atmosphere. Again, better precautions could have been taken when looking at damaged T-tails, which would be the root cause of that orbiter's demise. Damage that was caused during launch from chunks of insulation foam falling away from the external tank, striking and injuring her portside wing. Again, this event caused a change in protocols, including a full visual inspection of the craft before departing the ISS to return to Earth, and in the 22 flights that followed, there were no further incidents. Just as a side note while we're here, for those people who didn't grow up with Shuttle and are wondering how the Shuttle docked with the ISS, and with the Russian station Mir 11 times, her airlock was built into the cargo compartment, just behind the pressurized cabin that accommodated 7 people. When people talk about reusability in spacecraft and ignore the fact that the only component of the shuttle that was not reused was the expendable external tank, they discredit themselves. Pretending that rocket reusability is the invention of Musk and SpaceX only demonstrates the lack of knowledge possessed by the person making that claim. The same people will also call Falcon a completely reusable craft, which, of course, it is not. The large second stage of a Falcon launch pictured here will either burn up in the atmosphere or add to the junkyard currently in orbit. And the trunk of Crew Dragon is also jettisoned before the capsule re-enters the atmosphere to splash down off the coast of Florida. Depending on the lift requirements for a contract, Falcon and Falcon Heavy launches don't even always attempt landings of their boosters, because that feature results in a lower mass-to-orbit capability. The yet again postponed Falcon Heavy launch, due now later this month, will not be attempting to recover any of the boosters from the launch because they can't afford the loss of performance. Also, when people compare the cost of the shuttle program to the cost of the payload to orbit provided by the Falcon Dragon system, or even worse, the imaginary Starship numbers, they ignore the fact that Shuttle didn't deliver cargo or crew. It delivered cargo, payloads, and crew. Shuttle was able to bring 7 people at a time to space, along with whatever their mission manifest required, along with payloads up to 30 tons. Any comparison that people make of Falcon Dragon versus Shuttle is no comparison at all, especially when talking about a cost per pound to orbit. After delivering their payload or visiting the ISS when their mission was over, Shuttle re-entered the atmosphere butt first and upside down, then performed a deorbit burn to kill off some speed before they flipped her over to be right side up. Shuttle would then glide to and land on a designated runway, allowing astronauts on board to walk out of the vehicle, down a set of steps, onto dry land. With Crew Dragon, SpaceX has had to revert back to Apollo-era tech, requiring the very small manned capsule with little downmass capability to parachute into the ocean to be retrieved. A huge step backwards compared to the advances made with Shuttle. The 5 shuttles flew for 3 decades, from 1981's pilot launch of Columbia to the final flight of Atlantis in 2011. The Shuttle program had an expected shelf life of 10 years per craft, and leading up to their retirement, under Bill Clinton, NASA initiated the Reusable Launch Vehicle program. Rockwell International, McDonnell Douglas, and Lockheed Martin all put in proposals that passed Phase 1 of the process. The uncrewed Lockheed Martin X-33 and the larger crewed version called Venture Star were SSTOs that emerged as the leading contenders. The Rockwell International proposal, also called X-33, was an SSTO version of the Shuttle proposed to launch without benefit of the booster assembly using a pair of RL-10-5A engines along with a single SSME. In the McDonnell Douglas DCX, also known as the Delta Clipper, and the improved DCX-A, became a proving platform for a next generation of SSTO single-stage-to-orbit spacecraft, which would re-land on a designated pad. Described as a gleaming white pyramid, it was designed to sit upright on its base and blast into orbit without any other assistance. When testing began at White Sands in New Mexico, it took off, hovered at 150 feet, and re-landed in a target zone. NASA started to believe that this rocket could significantly reduce the cost to orbit, dropping the price of delivering a person to about the same price as a luxury cruise. The larger DCX-A performed similar tests with similar results, rising to an elevation of 10,000 feet, then crossing over and landing in their target zone. However, its third demonstration flight ended in the destruction of the craft after landing, thanks to a landing leg that failed to deploy.
She's coming over.
In the end, none of these vehicles made it through to production. Despite George W. Bush pushing for a new space vehicle that could also possibly return people to the moon, the Obama administration retired the shuttle fleet without having a suitable replacement ready to go, and as a result, the US allowed their manned access to space to become the domain of the Russian Soyuz system. One of the questions we've had for years about Shuttle, as the most versatile of all spacecraft to ever fly, is why was it never revisited, upgraded and updated with new materials to make it lighter and stronger? New tech that would allow it to perform new functions, or at least reinstate its old functions with equipment that is now smaller, faster, lighter, and better. As for instance, in the case of SpaceX and Starship, instead of going through every single step and misstep of development to create a brand new, inferior machine, why not pick up where Shuttle left off? Use those connections at NASA to get the blueprints for the orbiter, strip it down to the struts, and build it back better by asking the people who flew on it for their input on what worked, what didn't, and what wasn't considered crucially important before it reached orbit that became very apparent later. Then to get this new shuttle into space, take what you learned from the Falcon program to create next-gen boosters and strap a pair of those to the belly of the next-gen shuttle to yeet it into orbit. It seems to us that that would have been a much more productive use of the past decade instead of whatever it is they're doing in Boca Chica. Now that opens up another question. If we are going to take new material science and new levels of technology and apply them to a system in the hopes of creating something bigger and better, is Shuttle the right candidate for that redux? After all, Shuttle was another variation of a rocket launch, and every rocket launch has inherent risk. When it comes to the Space Shuttle program, what needs to be mentioned is that the orbiter itself was flawless on launch. Both losses of vehicles, LOVs, from the Shuttle program were in fact the fault of the giant tanks and boosters it took to launch her into space. So the biggest danger facing Shuttle was that it was still an iteration of a rocket launch. But prior to developing the Shuttle, Rockwell, the company that created her, had been working on something very different that had captured the imagination of space enthusiasts and space agencies alike. and it was born out of the 1970s oil crises in the US. In 1973, in retaliation for rearming Israel during the Arab-Israeli War, Arab members of OPEC imposed an oil embargo against the US to gain some leverage in the peace negotiations. That decision sent lawmakers and scientists scrambling to come up with solutions to meet the growing US energy needs. Jimmy Carter addressed the nation in April of 1977 about his new 10-principle energy policy, which included the US having to look to new and unconventional forms of energy. And wouldn't you know it? Harnessing solar energy was one of the solutions they came up with 50 years ago, but not fields upon fields of solar panels on the ground. No, a proposal for a constellation of 60 giant solar stations in geosynchronous orbit that would beam collected energy down to massive rectangular stations on the ground in the form of microwaves was conceptualized to power the continental US. The Satellite Power System, acronym SPS, was spelled out in this Satellite Systems Division, Space Systems Group, paper from Rockwell International dated March of 1979. Each one of these stations in geostationary orbit would weigh about 50,000 tons, with solar arrays on either side measuring roughly 5 kilometers long by 4 kilometers wide, giving each station an overall length of 11.73 kilometers. Rockwell and NASA worked this concept out, right down to the amount of gold and silver they were going to require for the circuitry. In fact, here's a list from the report of the top 8 materials required that were most likely to cause the agency some issues in collecting them in the quantities necessary. We've added today's market value for each commodity to keep a running tally reported as millions in the right-hand column. The SPS would require 533,000 pounds of cobalt, which even on the chart is recognized as primarily coming from Zaire, making it susceptible to interruption due to internal military conflict. The system would also require about 3 million pounds of gallium, 3,750,000 pounds of gold. Even in the 1970s, that would have carried a hefty price tag at $240 per ounce. Today, at $30,000 per pound, this industrial metal requirement alone would run a price tag of $112.5 billion. 5.5 million pounds of Kapton or polyamide film, 6 million pounds of sapphire glass ribbon, 392,000 pounds of silver, which seems an easy ask in comparison to the other numbers, like 2 million pounds of Teflon, and the biggest material need on this list was almost 12 million pounds of tungsten, a metal whose production relies heavily on communist China, which holds 75% of known tungsten reserves. That list of commodities alone comes to 16,500 tons, and a current price tag of $113.8 billion. This diagram illustrates how Rockwell and NASA intended to lift personnel and equipment into orbit to assemble these solar stations at a rate of 2 per year for 30 years. You'll notice in the diagrams from the proposal that the Rockwell Space Shuttle was to play a major role in this project, which had operations in LEO as well as in geostationary orbit where this giant array would reside, beaming power down to the continental US. The shuttle's role in SPS was not as the main delivery vehicle for supplies. It was a crew transport and initial habitat for workers in orbit. The bulk of the material mass was to be lifted into orbit by a different vehicle with the acronym HLLV, the Heavy Lift Launch Vehicle, capable of bringing a far larger payload to orbit than the 25 to 30 tons the space shuttle was designed to handle. Rockwell already had a design in mind for the HLLV, originally brainstormed in the 60s and dusted off for this purpose. Their air breather rocket-powered horizontal takeoff tri-delta flying wing single-stage to orbit transportation system, which was given the moniker Star-Raker. This massive rocket-assisted spaceplane was to be the space equivalent of a tractor-trailer, hauling 100 tons of material at a time to LEO without the need for multi-stage rockets or massive SRBs. It could take off from any airport with a suitable runway, land at any other suitable airport or spaceport closer to the equator, load a payload through her nose, which swung out of the way, similar to a C-5 Galaxy, using military logistics that already exist, then refill propellants and use that same runway to take off for an equatorial orbit. 10 air-breathing supersonic ramjet engines powered by liquid hydrogen would take the Star-Raker through the thickest part of our atmosphere to a cruising altitude of 45,000 feet, reaching speeds upwards of Mach 6. And when they were ready to break through the Kármán line, the pilots would drop the nose and dive 8,000 feet to build up additional speed to Mach 7.2, then climb again and hit the 3 SSME shuttle-type rockets to climb all the way into LEO to deliver their payload. Docking with the receiving station in orbit was a simple matter of swinging the nose cone out of the way again, giving full access to the cavernous cargo hold. The 100 tons of cargo could easily be moved from the ship to a receiving bay, after which Star-Raker would then depart to Earth, likely on the same day. Star-Raker would then re-enter the Earth's atmosphere much the same way that Space Shuttle did, backwards and upside down, then conducting a deorbit burn to reduce their velocity. Because of the wide surface area of the wings on Star-Raker, the spaceplane was better able to take a much easier, more controlled approach to any runway of their choice under their own power once the air-breathing, hydrogen-powered jets fired back up. The Shuttle did not share that feature of coming in under their own power. Shuttle had to glide to their receiving runway. All of these processes were worked out on paper, and Rockwell determined that a fleet of these vehicles would be able to conduct up to 3 missions per day, roughly 1,000 flights per year. With a plan to produce 22 units, this would match or exceed the materials lift-to-orbit cadence required to keep the SPS properly supplied and on schedule to build 2 solar stations per year for the next 3 decades. If you're breaking down the numbers here between Star-Raker and Starship, the Starship intends to use 1,200 tons of propellant and 3,600 tons of propellant in the Super Heavy booster to deliver 100 tons of payload to LEO. The total weight of a fully fueled Starship and booster would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 5,000 metric tons. 100 tons payload over 5,000 tons GVW is a 2% payload to vehicle mass ratio. Star-Raker was also designed to take 100 tons to orbit. The greatest difference between the two vehicles is this fully fueled vehicle only weighed 2,300 tons, which right off the bat gives this vehicle a 4.3% payload to vehicle mass ratio. But if we work out the numbers so that it's represented as a ratio of propellant used, then it works out even better for Star-Raker. 3,600 tons of propellant in the booster, 1,200 tons in the second stage. You're talking 4,800 tons of propellant for 100 tons of payload in Starship. Not far off of the 2% marker from before, rising to 2.1%. And of course, the Starship is using methane, so the exhaust will be a combination of carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and water vapor. The Star-Raker, designed to use less than half the amount of propellant load from Starship at 2,000 tons per mission, burning liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, resulting in an exhaust gas of almost pure water vapor. That takes the ratio up to an even 5%, better than double the numbers from the Starship, with none of the chemical pollution in the exhaust. And of course, Star-Raker didn't need any special launch facilities to get into the air. No launch complex or tower, no exclusion zones, didn't even need lightning stands. Just a supply of liquid hydrogen and a runway suitably long enough for larger military craft. Add everything up and the Star-Raker comes out on top by a considerable margin, despite the size of her. How big are we talking? Well, here we have the ISS, and this is what it would look like if a Star-Raker was approaching for docking. To put things into perspective, let's also include a space shuttle and a Starship. Imagine being able to get the 430 tons of mass it took to build the ISS into orbit in under a week, using only 2 spaceplanes that launched from and returned to conventional runways to be checked over to fly again. Using Rockwell's numbers, that was theoretically possible. The empty cargo hold of the Star-Raker was designed to be 20 feet across by 20 feet high by 141.5 feet long, about 56,000 cubic feet. In metric, that's roughly 6 by 6 by 43 meters for a volume of 1,548 cubic meters. In comparison, Starship's entire pressurized area is said to be up to 1,100 cubic meters for cargo, which would have to include all the life support equipment, logistical supplies, and living quarters. On Star-Raker, it's just one giant empty cavern that could be loaded up on the ground using a forklift or pallet jacks. As long as the load is strapped tight to the floor and roughly balanced from side to side, that's as secure as things needed to be. Not at all like the logistics of loading 100 tons of supplies into an upright tube through a tiny airlock 100 feet or more in the air, then fussing about with it once it enters the ship. And after you get to where you're going, do the same thing in reverse in microgravity. Take a look at this HLS Starship design from Design Freedom. Not an official drawing from SpaceX, but a good visualization. Where the hell are you going to stow 100 tons of cargo in this rat maze? And what will everything in this diagram weigh to begin with, thereby taking away from your upmass capability? Now, if you'll notice, this is the layout for a 6-person crew, or a dozen if they're going to share bunks. We're really looking forward to seeing how they redesign this to accommodate a 100-person crew going to Mars. For those of you thinking that 300-foot wingspan is a little on the large side, you'd be right. But you'd be wrong if you thought it was the largest one ever. In fact, Howard Hughes was able to create the 320-foot wingspan of his Spruce Goose entirely out of wood in the 40s. After 5 years of development and setbacks, not the least of which was the end of World War II military spending, the Hughes H-4 Hercules flew a single time in November of 1947. 75 years ago, Hughes worked out that wingspan using floats instead of landing gear with a plane made of wood. And we've come a long way in engineering and material development since then. When Rockwell first envisioned a heavy lift SSTO concept in the 1960s, material sciences and engineering had not advanced to the point where building such a craft was possible yet. But by the time Rockwell unveiled Star-Raker in the 1970s, in association with the SPS project, new materials incorporated into a wet wing design now had Rockwell convinced they could build her using the technology and materials of the day. They believed a fleet of Star-Rakers could be built and flown often enough to build 2 massive solar arrays per year for the next 30 years. In their calculations, Rockwell also worked out the cost per pound to orbit would be somewhere between $10 to $15 per pound in the 1980s, or $36 to $55 per pound in today's money. In comparison, SpaceX just bumped up their per kilogram rate to $5,500 per kilogram a year ago. So if the Star-Raker could pull off Rockwell's projections, it would eat SpaceX's lunch. So why did Star-Raker, with its obvious next-gen advantages over even today's space vehicles, never make it into production? Several factors played into this. One such factor, the end of Jimmy Carter's one-term presidency, courtesy of a Reagan landslide victory, forced a change of administration and shifted the political landscape in 1980. But the biggest factor, the energy crisis of the 70s, the impetus that began this investigation into what may be possible, came to a close with renewed access to cheaper domestic petroleum and turning to other forms of energy to reduce reliance on foreign oil. New coal technology came online. Natural gas infrastructure and federal regulation was passed into law with the Natural Gas Policy Act of 1978. And the development of nuclear power production, in its infancy during the 50s and 60s, was now maturing into systems like the CANDU reactor. Developed in Canada in the mid-50s, installed in Ontario at Darlington and Pickering in the 60s and 70s, and the first international exports went to Romania, South Korea, Argentina, and China during the 80s and 90s. With these forms of energy taking much of the burden off of oil exports, eventually causing a 1980s oil glut, the daunting proposal of financing a giant array of massive solar stations no longer made economic sense. If you don't need the massive satellites, you don't need the massive delivery system. And with Shuttle already tested out and flying by 1981, able to perform as both a delivery and maintenance LEO vehicle, the need for a giant space cargo plane like Star-Raker disappeared. At least at the time, there was no need for anything larger, so they threw this baby out with the bathwater and Star-Raker got archived. But here we are now at the beginning of the commercial space era, and all the bold ideas and old fantasies are new again. Solar arrays in orbit once again being considered, space elevators, moon colonies, orbiting hotels, refueling depots, asteroid mining. They've all been thought up before decades ago, but not thoroughly. Let's take 16 Psyche as an example of the lack of thought that can be put into a single rock. Space agencies are convinced that 16 Psyche, believed to be a stripped-down planetary core, contains 24 million trillion tons of metal. Based on current market prices, that would give this asteroid a notional value of $10 quintillion. Foolish headlines, written by simpletons who can't keyword the previous sentence, announced that mining this rock would make every person on the planet a billionaire. And anybody believing that garbage has no clue about how supply and demand work on the value of precious metals, or how economies work, or who would be the recipient of profits if there even were any profits remaining by the time the smoke cleared.
I'm rich.
So here's a quick lesson for you. This is a visual representation of how much gold has been reportedly mined throughout all of human history, about 166,500 tons. Fits inside a 30 by 30 by 30 meter cube. It is more rare than you probably realize, and much of the value of gold is based on its rarity. If you were to double the amount of gold on Earth, that rarity value would get cut in half. If you 10x, then you lose 90% of the rarity value. Flood the market with volumes of gold or platinum or any other precious metal, in production volumes rivaling titanium or aluminum, and gold would become relatively worthless except as an industrial metal. This is basic supply and demand economics, first term stuff. They even covered this topic on Billions in Season 5 when Bobby was all gassed up on the limitless shit and had to be brought back down to Earth by Taylor.
Let's say you're right about this whole crazy play and you somehow pull it off and harvest more gold, platinum, tungsten, and cobalt than the world has ever known. It will all end up as worthless as sand because it will glut the market. Scarcity is the only thing that gives that stuff value, and you will have fundamentally destroyed that.
Fuck. So the more gold or any other metal that is brought back to Earth from that asteroid, the more of a negative impact it will have on that metal commodity price, making each trip less and less profitable for the company or space agency mining it. Mining 16 Psyche could not and will not, by any stretch of the imagination, save the world economy any more than it would make everybody on Earth rich. However, that is not stopping space agencies and greedy billionaires from looking at that 226-kilometer wide monster as a cash cow. And if anybody is going to give mining 16 Psyche or any other asteroid or the moon a go, then they'll have to be able to get gear and people into space reliably and economically. The linchpin of every large-scale space endeavor is getting material and personnel into space, and so far that has not advanced beyond exploding cylinders hurling mass skyward. Take a look at the V-2 rocket from World War II. The general shape is not significantly different than the SpaceX Starship. Both are long, cylindrical tubes. And being fair, so is almost every other new rocket under development, with some artistic liberties added to the mix. Just off the top of our heads, you've got SpaceX, Blue Origin, Rocket Lab, Astra, Firefly, and Relativity Space, all trying to outdo their competitors with their own variation of a very similar concept. You've also got companies such as ULA and Northrop Grumman, who are established contractors for NASA that have no independent aspirations to colonize space. So really, we've got a limited talent pool spread across multiple private companies trying to reinvent the rocketry wheel, which in the end will always be governed by the rocket equation. In this field, competition is not leading to groundbreaking rocket achievements like we saw in the 60s and 70s. But if you look at the planes from World War II and compare them to what flies today, that's where you see tremendous amounts of advancement. Although jets were just coming into service in the late 30s and early 40s, most of the planes flown in the Second World War were fighters and bombers relying on propellers to pull them through the air. Transatlantic commercial airliners, such as the propeller-driven Douglas DC-4, were just conducting test flights in the months leading up to World War II. Now we have massive aircraft flying thousands of trips daily, with some planes such as the Airbus A380 carrying upwards of 500 people at a time using 4 massive jet engines which continue to be refined. If planes are where the biggest advancements are being made, would it not make sense to take those advancements in material sciences and technology and propulsion to revisit the Star-Raker, since Rockwell, the people who built the shuttle, already invented that wheel? Musk is often quoted as saying the holy grail of space is a rapidly reusable orbital rocket. As with most statements he makes, he's only partially right. The rapidly reusable vehicle does not have to be a rocket at all. And as we know, relying on rockets to force mass through the thickest part of our atmosphere comes with a very large set of inherent risks. There have been launch platforms built out already that use massive planes for the initial stages of the launch, but the planes themselves don't ever leave the atmosphere. The largest of these systems has the greatest wingspan in the world, the 385-foot wide Stratolauncher, which was designed to carry a multi-stage rocket weighing up to 250 tons, including propellant, to a cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, then release it so the rocket can continue to space under its own power. The Stratolauncher, presently under development, has flown 10 times to date, and the first flight where they intend to release their payload is coming up for later this year. Virgin Galactic also has a double-hulled lifting craft system that releases a small spaceplane that continues onto the edge of space, a system that Sir Richard Branson tested out personally during a flight in July of 2021. After almost 2 years on the ground, an upgraded version of the carrier plane Eve had a successful test flight in February of 2023, as that company looks to resume flight operations later this year with their fully reusable system. Another platform Virgin developed through Virgin Orbit, a spin-off from Virgin Galactic, was to release a multi-stage rocket from the underwing of a 747-400. After their first attempt to reach orbit failed in 2020, Virgin Orbit had 4 successful flights in 2021 and 2022, with each of those rockets delivering payloads to orbit with that system. Then a flight in January of 2023, launched from the spaceport Cornwall in the UK, suffered an anomaly and failure, causing the loss of 9 satellites for 7 different customers. Since then, Virgin Orbit has been forced to declare bankruptcy on April 4th of 2023, citing a failure to secure additional financing to cover their growing losses. One has to wonder if Virgin as a whole had not been chasing their own vestigial tail, burning hundreds of millions, possibly billions of investment dollars to create their own doomed version of Hyperloop. Maybe Branson would have been better able to execute this spaceplane company to avoid that bankruptcy. All of these systems require the development of not one, but 2 completely different types of vehicle to work together, the launcher vehicle and the space vehicle. This paradigm would divide the manpower and brainpower required to complete each project. The Star-Raker, with the versatility of an airliner combined with her delivery capability to orbit, offered a much more simple and elegant solution. As they say, the best part is no part at all. Ever since we started producing our shows, critics of this channel have gone on at length about how we never offer solutions to the problems that we find with other people's promised technology that generally turns out to be vaporware. And that is absolutely, unabashedly true. It is not our job to find real-world solutions for your vaporware products. On the other side of the coin, there are many pro-Skeptic subscribers that have made comments on various episodes and in the live chat that if a company was smart, they would add us to their planning team or advisory board. If mainstream media was on the ball, they would add us to their bullpen of investigative journalists. And a couple of times, we even made the comment that people who find solutions get paid for their work, and that if anybody would like to add us to their team, all they need to do is ask us to join. Well, guess what? Somebody did. In the interest of full disclosure, the reason why Star-Raker came onto our radar in the first place is because we were recently approached by a company who has the ambition to take on the Star-Raker concept, to try to get it from the drawing board to the runway by applying modern technology and materials. The more we looked into the Star-Raker design and Rockwell's ambition for that project, the more intrigued we became with it and the more sense it made. After reading every article we could find, it became obvious that Star-Raker is quite widely believed to be a lost opportunity to revolutionize space travel. Imagine having just one of these machines in service, ready to launch to the ISS in case of emergency. So we accepted this company's early invitation to come on board in an advisory capacity, and for the past couple of weeks we have been assisting with their brainstorming that should set the foundation for their efforts moving forward. As they assemble their teams, lay out their operational roadmap, and make progress towards their goals, we'll introduce you to the company and the executives behind this effort. If everything goes as they hope it will, there may be opportunities for other qualified people to join those teams, so we will also make you aware of those job postings when they go live. If you are an engineer in a related field and think you could contribute to such a project, they're looking at having those teams in place by this fall, likely by September. For now, the company is in startup mode and any other reporting at this point would be premature. But it's pretty exciting to think that this mega machine is going to get another look, and we may be able to play a small role in that. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Common Sense Skeptic. We'd like to shout out HAZEGRAYART for their impressive rendering of the Star-Raker craft, which demonstrates how much interest the vehicle still has today. We'd also like to thank Kelly Starks for his conversations about Star-Raker, based on a paper that he published several years ago. If you have any comments to make about what kind of space vehicle you think is most likely to take over from rockets in the future, share them in the comments below. And if you have any stories or opinions to share about Star-Raker, we'd love to hear those too. And a special shout out for our patrons on Patreon that continue to support our content directly at patreon.com/theCommonSenseSkeptic. To support our channel in other ways, consider becoming a member, or simply like the video, share the video, and make sure you're subscribed so that you know when the Common Sense Skeptic returns.